Good morning. We're going to talk about imperialism in Africa and Latin America. I'm going to try to keep it short and brief so that you can get your notes. Make sure that you complete your check for understanding in your notes because you know I'm going to check them. And please listen carefully. Make sure you're not on YouTube or doing anything else but getting your notes and listening to Miss McCrae. So, imperialism, empire building. You know that the big countries that were active or big areas were Europe and America. And so today we're going to talk in reference to Africa here. And if you look, you can see Africa has been extremely imperialized between 1885 and 1914. And then we talk about imperialism in relation to America. A lot of times we try to act like we were not imperialistic, but we definitely were, especially in Latin America. So when we talk about Africa, European countries conquered and competed in Africa for natural resources. Each country believed that they would gain respect or potentially an economic advantage or like credibility or dominance by controlling more colonies. So more areas controlled means more power. This is called the scramble for Africa. Okay, I'm going to zoom in for a second. If you want to pause here, you can grab your notes, okay? When you look at this map here, if you look, you have Belgium, British, French, Germany, Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish. There's only one area that was independent, which was Ethiopia and Liberia. But if you look, the rest of Africa is dominated by European countries. Reasons: natural resources, setting up colonies. There are diamonds, gold, coal, natural resources in Africa. And because Europeans felt that they were above Africans, they thought they were inferior and that the white Europeans were a superior race, so they dominated over them instead of treating them as equal. So there's two theories that go along with this racial superiority and inferiority, which is called social Darwinism and the white man's burden. So when we talk about the white man's burden, this is a poem written by Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling has written some other poems, and I want you to take 1 second and add this to your notes. I want you to look up other pieces of literature that are written by him. So take a moment to pause and do that for me and add it to your notes because I'm going to look for it. Something famous that you would know. Social Darwinism applies to the natural selection of races. So if you think about Charles Darwin and how he believed there was survival of the fittest in society amongst animals, social Darwinism is going to be applied to races, which is extremely inappropriate. But during this time, they said natural selection of the races. So whites were superior to blacks or other people of color. So when I say Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, they're all non-white individuals. They're not European. They're not considered white American. And so what you have to understand is that they had a white man's burden where it was their burden to educate these quote-unquote savages or inferior people who have no home training or upbringing. But what you guys understand and what you've learned about with other kingdoms in Africa, Asia, and Latin America and South America is that they do have civilization. They have the 5 key traits of civilization. Just because their civilization looks different than Europeans doesn't mean that they are not advanced or civilized or have complex institutions. So Europeans believe that Africans were inferior, and they believe that it was their responsibility to modernize them. Modernization, in their eyes, looks different than modernization in other areas. Europeans use this mindset to justify their presence in Africa and to take their natural resources. What you have to understand is that they got land, labor, and capital out of Africa, which helps with industrialism. So I want you to look at this picture here. This is called Rhodes Colossus, and his legs are spread from Cape Town, South Africa to Cairo, Egypt. This was published in 1892 in Punch magazine. And if you're not familiar with Cecil Rhodes, he is an English imperialist, a financier and a mining magnate. He was he founded a country called Rhodesia, which means he took over an African nation, named it Rhodesia. He controlled South Africa. He was big on the diamond trade, like De Beers diamonds, and De Beers diamonds are still present today. But he had a very selfish or imperialistic viewpoint of Africa. Here's what he says: I contend that we are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, it is better for the human race. What an alteration there would be if they were brought under Anglo-Saxon rule. Anglo-Saxon is British. When you see this and you hear this comment, Cecil Rhodes saying we're the best race, we're the most top superior race, so that means that he ultimately believes everybody else is inferior, and that's how he justifies taking over Africa with other countries and other people. Take a look at that quote. Now, how is Latin America affected by imperialism? Well, there's the Spanish-American War, which happened in 1898. Reports of mistreatment by the Cubans by Spain. So Spain was involved in Cuba. The United States says, hey, we'll help you. We'll kick the Spanish out of Cuba. But then the United States ultimately says, hey, Europe, you can't be involved over here in our hemisphere, but we can be involved. And so the United States takes over all those Spanish colonies where they kicked Spain out of. So we take over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, etc. And don't forget, we're also involved in China during this time. So there's a couple of places where we say, hey, you can't be here, but we'll be here, okay? And so when you look at this, 10,000 miles from tip to tip, the Philadelphia Press. So if you look, it's got, let's see, Puerto Rico, the United States, and then you have Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines, 1898. So you see the eagle's wings are spreading over from Asia all the way to Latin America. So how did the United States assist the Western Hemisphere during the age of imperialism, and was it the U.S. actually helping? So the U.S. declares the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe, and they move it to the Monroe Doctrine, which is a document that talks about you get out of our hemisphere, you can't colonize our hemisphere. And so they say the Western Hemisphere is closed to European colonization. Okay? So just take a quick look at these political cartoons here. So if you see Uncle Sam's hat, Monroe Doctrine, it's on top of Latin America, and here you have your European leaders here and Uncle Sam. So the West Hemisphere, which we live in. And if you look at the Monroe Doctrine, you got Teddy Roosevelt hanging out right here on this cannon, pointing to a European monarch to protect Santo Domingo, which is the Dominican Republic. So, and you see that he's standing on Europe. Okay. So when we talk about imperialism in Africa and Asia, very similar, or Africa and Latin America, very similar to Asia. Make sure that you get your notes.